Husband sold our house without my permission and made us homeless within a day because he wanted to travel and live the van life, but just 6 months in he's back because this lifestyle isn't suited for him, so he wants to be his family once again. Thinking he has it all waiting to be served on a platter. But the look on his face was worth the wait when he realized he's getting served nothing but divorce papers instead. 6 months ago, my husband Mike destroyed our lives. You see, Mike and I were married for 3 years, and in all that time, I never saw any sign of trouble in our marriage. From the beginning, he was someone I thought I could depend on entirely, a solid, trustworthy partner who always seemed committed to our family. He used to be a devoted father to our 2 kids. He worked hard to provide for us and took pride in being there for our family. However, the turning point came when his mother passed away suddenly. Her death hit him harder than anything I'd seen before, and he became a different person in ways I struggled to understand. While I sympathized deeply with his grief, as I too had lost my parents at a young age, his reaction seemed very off for some reason. At first, it seemed almost minor. Mike would skip a day of work here and there. He'd tell me he was too tired to get up and go since his mother's death, and I thought maybe he just needed a break to recharge. But it soon turned into something much bigger. Instead of resting or looking for ways to work through his grief, he began spending entire days in the basement, glued to video games. Hours would pass and it was like he'd forgotten about everything outside that screen. His responsibilities, his family, even himself. Even then, I tried to be understanding, believing that he might be using gaming as a way to escape from the pain of his mother's passing. But as the days turned into weeks, with him always skipping work, I began to worry. You see, we depended on him financially. If I had my own job, perhaps I could have given him space to process things his way, but he was the one who had insisted on me being a stay-at-home mom. Early in our marriage, when we were preparing for our first child, Mike had strongly encouraged me to leave my job, saying he wanted our children to have a mother at home who could nurture and care for them full-time. So I agreed with him. It was a choice I made out of love for him and our future family. At the time, Mike had a stable, well-paying job and we worked hard to save a lot of money. But now, with him skipping work while we had 2 children to look after, the whole situation began to feel like a ticking time bomb. Every day he missed work increased my anxiety, leaving me terrified that eventually he'd be terminated and we'd have no way to support ourselves. On top of this, Mike also withdrew from helping with anything around the house. He barely interacted with the kids anymore and often ignored their requests for attention or playtime, leaving me to manage them alone. Simple tasks like loading the dishwasher or doing a few dishes suddenly became unbearable for him, and he refused to lift a finger. Personal care too fell by the wayside. Days would go by without him even taking a proper bath, and he would sometimes carry a stale smell, seeming oblivious to it. But the worst part was if I ever tried to talk to him about it, he would get agitated and angry. He would sometimes yell at me in front of our kids, something which he had never done before, leaving them confused and afraid. Eventually, the inevitable happened. His boss fired him. After weeks of absences and no formal communication, his company couldn't wait any longer. When Mike received the news, he exploded in anger, pacing around the house in a rage, throwing things, shouting at me and the kids if we dared to come near him. I tried to stay calm, cautiously telling him that we'd seen this coming after he'd been gone so long without notifying his boss. But this only seemed to trigger him. His face twisted with anger and he started yelling about how nobody understood him or what he was going through. He started mumbling about how he had given years of his life to the company and his boss had no right to just fire him. He furiously said that he was so pissed at his boss that he could even shoot him. I looked at him shocked and realized from the intensity in his face that he wasn't joking or exaggerating. He looked like he genuinely meant it. Now Mike was never a violent person, and before his mother's passing, if anyone would have told me that he would be talking like this, I would have never believed them. However, clearly, he had changed and seemed like an entirely different person. Hearing him say that he wanted to shoot his boss made my stomach twist in fear. At this point, I began to realize my husband's struggles might go deeper than grief or anger. He might be dealing with depression, something beyond what I could help him with alone. I decided to gently suggest he consider seeing a therapist. When I first brought it up, he was defensive and outright refusing to talk to a stranger about his problems. He brushed off the idea, claiming he didn't need help and that he'd figure things out on his own. But as his mood swings grew more severe and unpredictable, leading to frequent arguments and tension between us, he finally gave in and agreed to give therapy a try. I felt a spark of hope, thinking that maybe with professional guidance, he could find his way back to himself and to us. At first, I thought therapy might actually be making a difference, but soon it became clear that something wasn't right. Instead of focusing on healing or working through his issues, Mike began to develop strange and impulsive behaviors. Out of nowhere, he started spending lavishly on items we couldn't afford. Expensive perfumes, designer sneakers, things he'd never even cared about before. I reminded him that he was out of a job and we only had a limited savings, so he should not be spending whatever money we had left on buying unnecessary things. However, Mike just ignored me and started saying how he finally had clarity and he knew what he was doing. With each passing day, I watched our savings dwindle. It was painful and terrifying to think that if this continued, we could lose everything. The possibility of my children and me being left without a safety net or a stable home weighed on me constantly. I realized then that I couldn't rely on Mike to turn things around, at least not soon enough to make a difference. I needed to step up and find a job, any job, that could help us stay afloat. After days of searching and juggling interviews, I finally secured a part-time job at a fast food restaurant. It wasn't what I'd ever pictured myself doing, but it was a small step towards stability and I clung to that. But now my life had become an exhausting routine. Not only was I working part-time, but I was also handling every single responsibility around the house from laundry and cleaning to grocery shopping, paying bills. Everything fell on me. My children needed care, guidance, and comfort, especially now as they were beginning to sense the tension and changes in their father. I was stretched thin, balancing work and home life on my own, while Mike drifted further away from us. His days were spent in the basement, which he turned into a makeshift man cave. He was either there or out for therapy appointments, rarely interacting with the kids or me. He'd even barred us from going into the basement, making it clear that this space was off limits to any of us. Then, about 6 months ago, as I was preparing dinner in the kitchen and helping the kids with their school assignments, Mike came up from the basement practically buzzing with excitement. He looked like he was really happy and there was something I hadn't seen in him for a long time. At first, I felt a glimmer of hope, wondering if he might have finally secured a job to make things better for our family. I asked him what was going on and he started excitedly telling me that he'd been talking with his therapist. For days, they had been discussing what his dream future looks like, and apparently today he had finally taken the first step toward making that future happen. Confused, I asked him what he meant. Up until now, he had never mentioned any kind of dream future or life goals that he was working towards. Then Mike started telling me how ever since his mother passed, he'd felt too tied down by everything here, our life, our family, this home. He explained that for a long time, he'd been wanting to leave everything behind, to escape and start over somewhere far away. However, he couldn't just do that since he was married and had 2 kids, and this is why he had been depressed for months. I was taken aback, realizing the implication of what my husband just said. This was my husband, the father of our children, blaming us for his unhappiness. I looked over at our children who were still lingering nearby and gently asked them to go to their rooms so Mike and I could talk alone. I needed to understand exactly what Mike was talking about. So I asked him directly, "Why would you say something like that? What do you mean you want to leave everything behind?" Mike looked at me with a strange detachment, explaining that ever since his mother had passed, this entire city felt lifeless to him, as though nothing here held meaning anymore. The sense of emptiness, he said, had weighed on him so heavily that he could no longer stand the thought of staying. However, after talking to his therapist and realizing how short life can be, he was now going to work hard to make the most of whatever days he had left. Then came the real shock. Mike went on to tell me that after some serious thinking for months he had finally sold our home, which is why he looked so excited to talk to me. He continued to say that now he could finally move on to a new phase in his life where he would just be traveling across the country with no worries in the world. I froze, barely able to comprehend his words as Mike continued to say how he just wanted to live the van life from now on. "What do you mean you sold our house?" I asked, hoping I had misheard. But he started telling me how I should not worry because if I wanted, me and the kids could join him in living this dream life. Mike explained to me that he'd rather do it on his own, but if I insisted, he'd let us join him while traveling. According to him, he had sold our house at a very good price, and with this money he wanted to buy a van, convert it into a tiny house, and set out to live on the road embracing a nomadic van life. I stared at him, searching his face for any signs that he might be joking or maybe he had just lost his mind finally. But he looked serious, deadly serious. "You sold our house without even talking to me about it? Are you out of your mind, Mike? This is our home, our life. How could you make such a huge decision without including me? Do you even care what I want? Or is this just all about you and your so-called dream?" I could feel my face flush as I kept going. "We have responsibilities, Mike. Bills, stability, a future to think about. Not to mention, how do you expect us to live in a van? What about my job? What about everything we've built together? You just decided all of this on your own and expected me to be okay with it?" My voice cracked as the frustration, disbelief, and hurt spilled out all at once. "This is my house," he said flatly, "so I don't really need your permission to decide on what I want to do with it." With an almost rehearsed enthusiasm, he continued to convince me that this was the best decision for all of us. He pointed out how unhappy and sad he had been for months and had ignored me and the kids, but now for him to be happy again, he needed to do this. Hearing his words, a surge of anger flared up inside me. Anger I had been trying so hard to suppress over the past months. Did he honestly believe I would just go along with his ridiculous plan? He sold our home, the place where we raised our kids, shared memories, and built our lives without a single word to me beforehand. As the reality of his choice sank in, so did the practical fears. Where were we supposed to go now? That's completely up to you, Mike said. If you want to come with me, we can use the money I have to buy the van and start traveling. If not, well, maybe you can stay with one of your friends for now. But you'll need to figure out a place for you and the kids soon. I pointed out to him how the kids needed to go to school every day, and they couldn't do that if we lived in a van and roamed around. However, Mike argued that education didn't have to be learned from books or classrooms and that our kids could be taught from anywhere since nature is our greatest teacher. I scoffed at his response. He even suggested that we could make it work financially by taking up remote jobs while living on the road, jobs that would supposedly allow us to live freely and sustain our van life. My head started to pound as he went on and on. This sounded like a nightmare, like something from a story, not our real lives. Mike's words, his enthusiasm, and his complete detachment from reality made it feel as though I were talking to a stranger. Here he was expecting me to uproot everything, jeopardize our children's future, and dive into a life that he dreamed up on his own without a single thought of how it would impact us. I couldn't believe that because of this impulsive life-altering decision, our once stable world had come crashing down around us. Mike continued to press, insisting that as his partner I should support him in this new vision. He spoke with such enthusiasm, even mentioning that he couldn't wait to share this good news with our children if I agreed with his plan. His words stopped me in my tracks. For months, I had supported him through everything from the depths of his grief to his self-imposed isolation, his anger, his rash decisions, and even the financial fallout of his unemployment. I had stood by him, hoping that if I kept things stable, he would eventually come back to himself. But clearly, he did not deserve me anymore. I looked at him and, for the first time, let the truth come out. You're right, Mike. I am your wife, and I have supported you every single day since your mother's death. I have been there for you without fail. I took on everything from taking care of the kids and keeping up the house, to picking up a job to bring in money after you lost yours. I hoped that by holding it all together, you would come back to us. But now you've gone ahead and sold our house, the only security we have. And you expect us to abandon everything, to raise our children in a van with no stability and no plan? No, Mike, I won't do that, and I certainly won't let our children's lives be uprooted because of this. Mike looked at me with a mixture of confusion and frustration, asking why I was blaming him for his decision when all he wanted was to feel some happiness. Taking a steadying breath, I made it clear that he needed to find a way to undo the sale. I told him he should either return the money to the buyer and let us keep our home or, at the very least, buy a new place where we could settle down. Mike refused to do this, arguing that he couldn't just abandon his dream of living on the road because of me. He insisted that I was standing in the way of his happiness, as if his dream somehow justified throwing his family into the streets. I told him flatly that if living in a van was what he truly wanted, that he was welcome to pursue that. But I would not uproot myself and our children to live out his fantasy. The kids and I needed stability, and if that meant he would go on without us, then so be it. Mike stayed quiet, and I hoped he was taking time to think it over and would eventually choose to stay with us. But I couldn't have been more wrong. Without a second thought, Mike left us behind. Within a week, he had packed up his things and left us to live out his so-called van life dream. I just couldn't believe it. Me and the kids had nowhere to go. With no real support from Mike, I had no choice but to turn to my older sister, Lizzie, who graciously offered us a place to stay. Lizzie had always hated Mike, so when she found out that he had abandoned us to go live his dream life, she was even more furious. She pushed me to file for divorce immediately. At that moment though, I wasn't sure I was ready for that. I didn't have the financial means to proceed with the divorce, and everything was still so overwhelming. Honestly, I never imagined I'd find myself in this situation, facing the possibility of separation after everything me and Mike had been through together. I needed time to process everything, to catch my breath, and to figure out how I was going to rebuild our lives without him. Lizzie was the one who helped me find a new and better job as an assistant at her friend's boutique. This job was such an upgrade compared to my part-time fast food job. Even though I was happy to be earning well and being able to support my children, I still was heartbroken over losing my husband. My children were also confused. Mike didn't even have the decency to talk to them before leaving. As a result, the children were so confused about why their father wasn't coming home or why we were not living at our home anymore, and it broke my heart every time I couldn't give them a straight answer. I tried calling Mike, hoping he'd at least take a moment to talk to the kids to explain himself, but he refused to pick up. After a few weeks, He even disconnected his number altogether, which meant I couldn't even contact him. It was like he had completely erased himself from our lives, leaving me to carry the weight of his decisions while the children were left with nothing but unanswered questions. The past 6 months have been incredibly hard, but I've slowly managed to rebuild my life. The children have finally begun to settle down, and they've started to adjust to life without Mike. It's been a huge relief to see them happier, more at peace, and no longer burdened by the tension Mike's absence caused. As for me, I've come to terms with the reality that my life is no longer with him. I've accepted that our relationship is over, and I've spoken to a lawyer preparing to file for divorce. The only problem is I don't know where Mike is. He disappeared without a trace and none of his friends or family seem to have any idea where he is now. I considered hiring a private investigator to track him down, but I didn't want to waste any more money on him, especially after everything that had happened. Then out of nowhere, Mike reached out to me yesterday. At first, I didn't even recognize the number, an unknown one, but when he identified himself, I was taken aback. After so long, I was shocked that he was trying to contact me. He awkwardly asked how me and the children were doing, and I sarcastically told him we were doing just fine without him. He was asking me more about our lives, but I seized the opportunity to be clear with him. I told him that it was actually good that he had called because I wanted to serve him divorce papers. It was a long pause on the other end of the line. He finally spoke, his voice sounding somewhat shaken. He said he didn't expect me to just bring up divorce out of nowhere. I couldn't help but laugh at that considering this wasn't coming out of nowhere at all. This was the reality of what had been happening for months. He had abandoned us, leaving us without a house or any money, and yet he still expected us to stay married? That's when Mike started to tell me how he didn't want us to get a divorce. He pleaded that even though he had made a selfish decision by leaving, he was now fully healed and as good as new. Also, after all the time he spent on the road, he had come to realize that it wasn't as great as he had imagined. He missed us. He missed being a part of the family, and he wanted to come back to us. He begged me to give him a second chance. No, I refused outright. After all that had happened, after everything he had put us through, he thought he could just waltz back in and everything would be okay. I told him that I did not want him. In fact, me and the children didn't even need him anymore. We had moved on. We were doing just fine without him, and we were better off that way. Hearing this, Mike tried to argue with me, insisting that I was being too harsh and that he had changed on the road and that things could now go back to how they were, but I stood my ground. In the end, I told him he could take a few days to process everything, but I was going ahead with the divorce no matter what he felt. AITA. Update 1. Thank you everyone for your suggestions. To clarify a few points, Mike never reached out to us even once during his 6-month hiatus on the road. He never gave me any money or paid child support. Besides his mother, Mike was never really close to any of his family, so no one had any idea where he went during these past couple of months. For anyone out there speculating that maybe he was cheating or that he had some side chick, which is why he abandoned us in the first place and now that things didn't work out with her, he's coming back to us. Honestly, I don't care anymore. I'm not interested in digging into what he was doing or where he was. At this point, it doesn't even matter. The past is behind us, and whatever happened, happened. What I need now is clarity, peace, and stability for myself and the kids. At this point, all I want is a divorce from Mike. That's all. Update 2. So I finally met up with Mike and served him with divorce papers. At first, he thought that simply meeting with me would somehow prove to me that he had changed, that I would see the person he had become. He started by telling me that he now had a steady job and had been diligently saving money. He said that during his road trip, no matter where he went or what new place he tried to settle into, he only found himself missing me and the children. He pleaded with me asking for another chance, promising that this time he would do things differently. He even said he would buy a house for us again. I reminded him that he had sold our last house without my consent, a decision that had left me feeling betrayed and unimportant. He quickly promised that this time he would make sure I was included on the house deed so that I would feel secure and protected this time around. I just shook my head at his empty words and handed him the divorce papers. I knew better than to believe him this time. The look on his face when he realized what was actually happening, when he saw that he wasn't being handed a second chance, but instead a lawsuit for child support and divorce papers, was absolutely priceless. He seemed completely taken aback, almost like he couldn't believe it. He asked me in utter disbelief why I was doing this to him, especially since all he wanted was to reunite us as a family. I made it clear to him that if he truly wanted to be there for the kids, that was fine, but I didn't want anything more than that. I told him straight up that he was not my partner anymore and I wasn't about to let him disrupt my life again. I've been through enough. He tried to argue some more like he always does, but I wasn't having it. I just turned around and walked away. At that point, he wasn't even worth fighting with anymore. I've heard all the empty promises and seen the same pattern too many times to keep wasting my energy. I was done with the drama. Since then, Mike has been bombarding me with multiple voicemails, practically begging me to meet up with him again, asking for another chance. The way he's acting feels almost desperate and I can't help but feel irritated. He keeps texting me about how he lost his mother and now he's going to lose me and the kids too. The thing is, this man was the one who walked out on us in the first place, leaving us all behind without a second thought. And now here he is acting like he is the victim, trying to manipulate me into feeling responsible for his misery. It's like he thinks a few pleas will somehow erase the past, but that's not how it works. Update 3. It's been 7 months since my last update, and I apologize for the delay in updating anything here. Life has been a whirlwind, but I just wanted to share where things stand now. After a lengthy divorce process, I finally got my divorce from Mike. The court ordered him to pay child support every month just as I had wanted. Honestly, it was such a relief knowing I wouldn't have to shoulder all the children's responsibilities on my own anymore. On top of this, he was also ordered to pay all the overdue child support payments along with a hefty alimony as a consequence of abandoning his family all those months ago. As of now, Mike and I will share custody of the children, and I'm sort of okay with that. I want our kids to grow up with both their parents in their lives even though we're divorced. They deserve that stability, and